Hello friends, today my sermon comes from Matthew's Gospel chapter 14 verse 13 through 21, and I'm reading to you from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. It says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' Jesus said to them, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They replied, 'We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowd to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John contain various stories of Jesus' preaching, teaching, performing miracles, and interacting with people in different ways. But you might be surprised to know that the story we read today from Matthew's Gospel of the feeding of the large crowd is the only story that's included in all 4 Gospels. This indicates that it was very important for these 4 different writers to have recorded it. All 4 Gospel writers were from different locations, had different sources of information, and wrote from different perspectives. So today, I'll take a closer look at this story and what it meant for that community in the first century and what it means for us today. At first glance, the story reads as Jesus feeding hungry people, but the story has more layers than that. Matthew chapter 14 verse 13 says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." The question is, what did Jesus hear that made him go off for some quiet time? Well, the disciples had told him some bad news. They delivered the awful news that his cousin John the Baptist, the one who baptized him, the one he loved deeply, had been killed, that he was beheaded, and the disciples had already buried his body. You would imagine that this news devastated Jesus, and he withdrew because he was grieving for his cousin. But Jesus wasn't alone for a long time. The crowd heard where he was, and they followed him. And when he came back to shore, he saw the crowd. But even though Jesus was grieving, he still showed compassion on the crowd and healed those who were sick. As the evening progressed, the disciples told Jesus to send the crowds away because there was no access to food in that deserted place. The disciples only had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they knew that this wouldn't be enough to feed this large crowd. But Jesus thought otherwise and asked them to bring him the bread and the fish. He then blessed it and shares it with the people who were there. Now, the number of people in this crowd is an important element in this story. We've known the story to be the feeding of the 5,000, but the crowd was more than 5,000. All 4 gospel writers record that those who ate were 5,000 men, not including women and children. Some Bible scholars say if we included the number of women and children in the crowd, it may be about 10,000 people total. Others say it could have been up to 25,000 people. So we might ask the obvious question, how could 10,000 or 25,000 people be fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish? It is no surprise that this story has been scrutinized and debated for decades in the church by Bible scholars and preachers. But as you listen to this message today, I'd like to urge you to have an open mind and heart. Remember, these miracle stories were written to strengthen a community in the first century and build their faith in Christ. So there is a possibility that the number of the crowd might have been exaggerated a bit. But instead of being fixated on the number of loaves and fish or the number of people in the crowd, there is a deeper meaning to this story. And I'll get to that in a moment. This is not the first time in the Bible we read of people being fed. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 13 through 35, God provided manna or food for the Israelites in the wilderness. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8 through 16, God fed the prophet Elijah, a widow, and her son. In 2 Kings 4, 42 through 44, God fed 100 people with only 20 loaves of barley. But we must be cautious in the way we interpret these stories today. Jesus' feeding of the crowd in Matthew's gospel doesn't mean that God will miraculously feed all those who are hungry in our world today. You see, according to the United Nations World Food Program, there are 842 million hungry people in the world. And according to feedingamerica.org, 48 million Americans struggle with hunger in our nation every day. I'm also not going to argue on the real number of people Jesus fed or the number of loaves of bread or fish that was shared. You see, for me, this is more than a feeding miracle. This story is meant both to challenge and empower the disciples. It was more than just another meal. Jesus believed that community was essential to life, and that the needs of the community came first. Hunger violates the purposes of community life. Hunger violates the purposes of God for human life. And through this act of feeding the community, Jesus shows the disciples that they needed to take care of people's needs. If we want this Bible text to have meaning for us today, we need to be prepared to hear what it's really saying to us. This text is calling us to action and saying to do what Jesus did. Feed those who are hungry and trust that sufficient resources are available even in times of scarcity. Because God has identified himself with the poor and the hungry, so too each one of us is called to special concern for those who suffer. There are things each one of us can do, but are we willing to go the distance? Are we like the disciples who think that we just don't have the resources? Or are we willing to stretch ourselves and find ways to help people in need? The Bible isn't only about making us feel good about ourselves, but to give us a sense of purpose and responsibility for the wider community and world, to be God's hands and feet in the world. This is how I think about my own life. While I walk this earth, I'm here to enjoy my family, my relationships, good food, travel, and all the many privileges I enjoy. But I'm also here on this earth to be God's hands and feet and to do God's work so that others can have a full life as well. Each one of us is connected to each other and should feel a responsibility for others. As I conclude today, I leave you with the words of one of the greatest humanitarians who ever lived, Mahatma Gandhi. He said, "There are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread." So let's do what we can to feed the hungry and be God's agents in the world. Go now and be God's hands and feet. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord abides forever. Have a blessed and wonderful day. Goodbye for now.